The first flakes of snow were falling, light and sparse, as Alex pulled his car into the driveway of his childhood home. The woods surrounding it, bare and stark in the November chill, reached out like skeletal fingers. He hadn't been back in over a decade. But with his mother passing, the house was now his to clear out. Stepping out, he was immediately hit with an eerie sense of déjà vu. The memory of cold, sleepless nights at the age of 12 rushing back to him. The old, creaking house loomed over him, every shadowed window seeming to watch. Inside, it smelled of stale wood and dust, a scent that somehow transported him back to all those uneasy childhood moments, hiding under his blankets, heart pounding, waiting for sunrise. His mother had always insisted that strange things only happened in the house at night. When he was younger, he'd hear her whispering with her friends about spirits, shadows, and things that could never be explained. But as he grew older, he dismissed it all as superstition. Yet tonight, as he entered the house, he felt an unmistakable prickle down his spine. The first few hours were uneventful. He sorted through stacks of papers, yellowed photos, and faded relics. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, a chill settled over the house. Alex glanced at his watch. It was only 7 p.m., yet it felt like midnight. He could feel the darkness thickening outside, pressing against the windows. "All right, just a few more hours," he muttered, convincing himself he could get through this. "Then I'll leave." The first sound came from the hallway, just a quiet, dragging noise. Alex's ears perked up, and he held his breath, straining to hear. Nothing. He shook his head, blaming the creaky old house. He returned to the stack of letters he was sorting through, feeling his shoulders relax. Just as he did, the sound returned, this time louder. The dragging noise was followed by a soft tapping, rhythmic and slow. "Hello?" he called out, his voice faltering. Silence. Alex set the papers down, his eyes fixed on the darkened hallway. Heart pounding, he forced himself to walk toward it, each step heavy, reluctant. When he reached the hallway, he flipped the light switch, but the bulb only flickered once before dying out. The hallway sank back into shadow. "Great," he whispered, nerves fraying. He fumbled for his phone, using the flashlight to pierce the darkness. And that's when he saw it. There, at the end of the hallway, was the faint outline of a figure. It was hunched, barely more than a silhouette, but unmistakably there. Alex froze, his breath catching in his throat as the figure took a step forward, the dragging, tapping noise echoing. The figure spoke, its voice a harsh, wet whisper. "Alex," he gasped, stumbling back. He'd recognized that voice anywhere. It was his mother's. But the figure didn't look like her. It was hunched, limbs elongated and wrong, the face obscured by shadow. "Mom?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "Why did you leave me here?" the figure rasped, stepping closer. Its face came into the light, sunken eyes, a ghastly, too-wide grin twisting the features into a horrific mockery of his mother. "I didn't," he stammered, his mind racing. This couldn't be real. "You left me," she hissed, her voice like the scrape of nails on glass. "You left me with them." He backed up, pressing himself against the wall, unable to tear his gaze from the apparition. His mother's face twisted further, her skin seeming to stretch, crack, and peel. The creature moved toward him with jerky, unnatural movements, the dragging sound now unbearably loud. "Mom, please," he whispered, almost choking on the words. You're gone." The apparition tilted its head, that smile stretching impossibly wide. "Gone? No, Alex? I'm here. They let me stay. They promised they'd let you join me." The words oozed out, cold and slimy, slipping into his mind like an infection. A new sound, soft and chilling, filled the hallway. Laughter, low, echoing, growing louder by the second. Alex whipped his head around and saw shadows slithering along the walls, dark tendrils creeping closer, inching toward him. The laughter seemed to come from all directions, filling every corner of the house. The shadows took form, faces emerging from the darkness. Gaunt, eyeless, grinning shapes stretching and contorting as they moved toward him. He felt like he was drowning in their presence, their voices filling his mind, whispering terrible things he couldn't quite understand. "Join us, Alex," they chanted in unison, their voices merging into a sickly harmony. "You belong here." "No," Alex screamed, pushing himself off the wall, trying to escape the horrors closing in on him. He stumbled back into the living room, but the shadows were everywhere, lurking, reaching, clawing at him. In his panic, he turned toward the door, but it slammed shut with a thunderous boom. The walls seemed to pulse, as if alive, whispering to him, mocking him. He grabbed at the doorknob, twisting, pulling, but it wouldn't budge. The cold hands of unseen forces brushed against his skin, his mother's voice echoing in his mind. "You left me, Alex. Now you can stay with me. Forever." The shadows surged forward, engulfing him. He felt them seeping into his skin, cold and suffocating, filling him with darkness. His vision blurred, but he could still make out his mother's face, twisted, monstrous, looming over him. "Please," he whispered, voice barely a whisper. She reached out, her fingers brushing his cheek, but instead of warmth, he felt only an icy numbness spreading through him. "You're home, Alex," she murmured, her voice no longer harsh but almost tender. "We're all here, all of us who stayed." As his vision faded, he saw them, dozens, maybe hundreds of faces, all trapped in the shadows, all staring at him with hollow eyes. He could feel them, feel their pain, their despair, and he knew, with a sinking horror, that he would never leave this place. In that last moment, before darkness claimed him completely, he thought he saw his mother smile, a genuine, sad smile, as if welcoming him to a family reunion. The last thing he heard was her whisper in his ear, soft and chilling, "Now you'll never leave me again." Pulled through the trees as Sarah trudged up the narrow dirt road to her grandmother's, brighter, somehow cozier. Now it felt hollow, abandoned by time. After setting her bags down, she noticed a framed photograph hanging on the wall, a family portrait taken when she was around 8. Her grandmother's face in the photo seemed different than she remembered. The eyes looked hollow, almost too dark, as if the person looking back wasn't her grandmother at all. She shivered and glanced away. The first night passed uneventfully, but on the second, strange things began to happen. It started with a noise from upstairs, a faint dragging like something heavy being pulled across the floor. She was reading in the living room when it began, the sound creeping into her ears and filling her with an inexplicable terror. She set her book down, straining to listen. There it was again, slow and deliberate, a dragging that made her stomach twist. Every instinct told her not to investigate, to stay rooted to the spot, but curiosity and fear compelled her to move. She picked up her phone, using it as a flashlight as she climbed the staircase. The air grew colder with each step. At the top of the stairs, she noticed the door to her grandmother's old bedroom was open, just a crack. She didn't remember opening it, but the dragging noise was coming from there. With a shaky hand, she pushed the door open, her phone light casting eerie shadows over the dusty furniture. The room was empty. She let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding and turned to leave, only to stop dead in her tracks. The photograph from downstairs was now hanging on the wall in the hallway, right outside her grandmother's door. It wasn't just the same picture. She was certain it was the exact same frame and glass, even though she had just seen it downstairs. In the photograph, her grandmother's face had changed. The hollow eyes had widened, and her mouth was twisted into a grotesque, almost mocking smile. Sarah stumbled back, heart pounding. "No," she whispered, her voice a shaky plea. "This isn't real." The hallway seemed to stretch as she hurried back down the stairs. She didn't dare look over her shoulder, certain that if she did, she'd see something watching her. Back in the living room, she found the photo was still on the wall. Confused and horrified, she backed away, hands shaking. Then, she heard her grandmother's voice, a low, rasping whisper from upstairs. "Sarah, come up here." Her blood ran cold. She knew her grandmother had passed years ago. She had been at the funeral, had watched them lower the casket. Yet the voice was unmistakable, carrying the same tone her grandmother used when calling her for dinner as a child. "Sarah," the voice called again, fainter this time, but filled with a dreadful insistence. "Come up here, dear." Against her better judgment, Sarah felt her feet moving, drawn by some invisible force. She reached the staircase, her breath shallow and her heart pounding in her chest. Step by step, she climbed, her pulse thundering in her ears. When she reached the top, the hallway was darker than before, as if the shadows had thickened. The photo was gone from the wall outside her grandmother's room. The door was wide open, and the room beyond was pitch black. "Come closer," the voice urged, a faint, almost desperate plea. "It's so cold in here." As if in a trance, Sarah moved forward, her phone's flashlight barely cutting through the darkness. Her hand shook as she reached for the light switch on the wall, but when she flicked it, nothing happened. "Please," the voice whispered, softer now. "You left me here, Sarah. You left me all alone." Tears stung her eyes as she tried to understand, tried to reason. Her grandmother had always been kind and gentle, yet this voice was filled with bitterness, with something almost angry. "Come closer," it whispered, more insistent now. Taking a deep breath, Sarah stepped into the room. As she crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind her. She whirled around, clawing at the door, but it wouldn't budge. She screamed, pounding on the wood, her voice echoing back at her. "Why did you leave me?" The voice hissed, right behind her ear. Sarah spun around, her phone's light landing on the figure now standing inches away. It was her grandmother, or something that looked like her. The figure's eyes were black pits, sunken deep into its face, and the skin was stretched tight over sharp, angular bones. The mouth hung open in an unnatural grin, revealing rows of cracked, rotting teeth. "You left me here," it rasped, reaching out with bony fingers. "You abandoned me." "Grandma, no," Sarah whispered, backing up until she hit the wall. "You're not real." "Oh, I'm very real, my dear," it sneered, its voice warping into something harsh, guttural. "And you'll never leave again." The lights flickered on, and for a moment the room was empty. She was alone, shaking and gasping, thinking perhaps it had all been a hallucination. Then she looked down at her hand. There, on her skin, were dark, bruised fingerprints, as if someone or something had gripped her wrist tightly. The lights went out again, and in the silence she heard the voice, now inside her own head, echoing. "Welcome home." The train rattled through the countryside as Jennifer stared out the window, watching the darkness swallow the landscape. She was the only one in her compartment, which suited her just fine. This late-night trip was an impulse decision, a way to clear her head after an argument with her boyfriend. The train was quiet, eerie even, with only the occasional shuffling sound from the other compartments breaking the silence. Around midnight, she noticed the first strange thing. The train was supposed to make frequent stops at small towns along the way, but it hadn't stopped for over an hour. She checked her phone, but there was no signal. Frustrated, she stood up and made her way down the corridor to look for a conductor. Each compartment she passed was empty. Seats were vacant, lights dimmed, and an unsettling silence filled the air. A cold draft brushed past her, though the windows were all sealed. She shivered and pulled her coat tighter, lay, continuing down the corridor. Eventually, she reached the end of the carriage, where a door led to the next. She pressed the button to open it, and as the door slid open, a dense fog drifted inside, swallowing her feet. Startled, she took a step back, blinking at the thick mist swirling around her. The carriage ahead looked nearly identical, but somehow off. The lights flickered, casting shadows that seemed to move and stretch along the walls. "Hello?" she called out, her voice sounding small and uncertain. There was no answer. Jennifer hesitated but felt compelled to step through. As soon as she entered the next carriage, the door behind her closed with a loud hiss, and she heard a faint, eerie tune, almost like an old lullaby, floating through the air. It was a song she knew, one her mother had sung to her as a child, but it sounded warped, slowed down as if it were being played on an old, broken record. She turned, but no one was there. "Is someone playing a prank?" she muttered, her voice unsteady. She moved deeper into the carriage, her footsteps echoing. The air grew colder, her breath visible in soft puffs. There was an uneasy silence, the kind that fills the space before something terrible happens. Then she saw him. A man sat in one of the seats, back turned toward her. He was wearing an old-fashioned suit, with a bowler hat perched on his head. His clothes looked worn, covered in a fine layer of dust, as if he'd been sitting there for decades. "Excuse me," she said, feeling a strange, gnawing fear in the pit of her stomach. The man didn't move. She could hear him breathing, slow, deep, labored breaths. She took a cautious step forward. "Sir?" Slowly, the man's head turned, revealing a pale, lifeless face with hollow, sunken eyes. His mouth was stretched into an unnatural smile, his teeth yellowed and crooked. "Welcome aboard, Jennifer," he rasped, his voice rough and distant, as though it were coming from deep underground. Her heart thundered in her chest. She took a step back, and he tilted his head, still grinning. "How do you know my name?" she whispered, terror rooting her to the spot. "Because you've been here before," he replied, his voice dripping with something dark and ancient. "You just don't remember." She shook her head. "I've never been on this train before." He laughed, a low, haunting sound that sent chills down her spine. "Oh, but you have." "We all come back eventually. The train never forgets." She stumbled backward, nearly tripping as she backed away from him. When she turned to run, the corridor seemed longer, stretching endlessly before her. The eerie tune grew louder, distorted, filling the space with its haunting melody. As she ran, shadows crept along the walls, forming figures that seemed to reach out for her, their hands elongated and bony. Her footsteps echoed in her ears, and she felt as though she was running in place, the exit never getting any closer. Desperate, she stopped, gasping for breath, and turned back. The man was gone, but another figure stood where he had been, a little girl with long, dark hair covering her face. She wore a faded, torn dress, her hands clasped in front of her. "Jennifer," the girl whispered, her voice a chilling echo. Jennifer's heart nearly stopped. What do you want?" "You left us here," the girl whispered, her head tilting to one side. "You left us in the dark." "I don't know you," Jennifer cried, stepping back, but the girl only moved closer, gliding soundlessly across the floor. The lights flickered, and suddenly Jennifer was surrounded by dozens of figures, their faces pale and ghostly, their eyes hollow and empty. They all stared at her, silent, accusing. "You left us behind," they murmured in unison, their voices blending together in a dreadful chorus. "What are you talking about?" She whimpered, tears streaming down her face. One of the figures, a young woman with empty, blackened eyes, stepped forward, pointing a bony finger at her. "You were one of us. You were meant to stay, but you left, and now you've come back." Jennifer shook her head frantically. "No, I've never been here before. I've never even seen this train." The girl with the dark hair moved closer, her face obscured by shadow. "Once you board the train, you can never leave," she whispered, her voice sharp, echoing with bitterness. The figures began to close in, their faces contorted with anger and despair. She tried to back away, but there was nowhere left to go. She was surrounded, the icy touch of their hands grazing her arms, her shoulders pulling her down. "You belong with us, Jennifer," they chanted. "You belong here. Forever." She screamed, but no sound escaped her lips. Darkness swallowed her, and the last thing she saw was the little girl's face, smiling. The train continued on through the night, silent and ghostly, with no conductor, no passengers, and no destination. As the rain poured down, Maria regretted taking the lonely back road home. Her headlights barely pierced the thick sheets of rain, and the tall trees on either side of the road seemed to close in, their branches reaching out like twisted, grasping fingers. She checked her phone, but of course there was no signal, just her luck. A loud bang shook her car, and it jerked to a sudden stop. Heart pounding, she tried restarting the engine, but it only sputtered and died. With a sinking feeling, she realized she'd have to get out and check what had happened. Pulling up the hood of her jacket, she stepped out into the downpour. Her flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the flat tire. Cursing under her breath, she opened the trunk to look for the spare, but found only an empty, rain-drenched space. She slammed the trunk shut, feeling frustration and unease rise within her. That's when she noticed it, a faint light flickering in the woods, a little further down the road. It was strange, almost like candlelight, wavering and unnatural. She was miles from the nearest town, and she hadn't seen a house in ages. She hesitated, staring at the light, feeling a strange pull. But when it flickered out, leaving only the impenetrable darkness of the trees, she felt a wave of relief. It was then that she heard the whispering. It started as a soft hum, barely audible over the rain. But as she strained to listen, the sound became clearer, a chorus of voices whispering her name in low, insistent tones. "Maria!" She froze, her heart hammering. The whispers seemed to come from all directions, seeping through the trees, filling the air around her. She spun around, her flashlight darting through the darkness, but there was no one there. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. The only answer was the whispering, louder now, insistent and eerie. "Maria, come with us." She felt a chill crawl up her spine. The whispers were calling her deeper into the woods, beckoning her with an unnatural pull that she struggled to resist. She turned back toward her car, intending to get back inside and lock the doors, but something was different. The road was gone. Where there should have been asphalt and yellow lines, there was only wet earth and fallen leaves. She felt a surge of panic, looking around wildly, but the trees had closed in, thick and foreboding, as if the forest itself had swallowed the road. Her flashlight flickered, casting brief, haunting shadows that twisted and writhed among the trees. She shook it, her heart racing, but the light faded completely, leaving her in utter darkness. Maria, you can't leave. She turned, and there they were, figures emerging from the shadows, pale and featureless, their faces blank masks with hollow eyes. They moved soundlessly, drifting closer, their limbs twisting in unnatural angles. The air grew colder as they surrounded her, their whispers filling her ears, pressing into her mind. Stay with us. Stay forever. No, she screamed, backing up, her hands trembling as she fumbled for her phone. But the screen was blank, dead. She was completely alone, cut off from everything. One of the figures reached out, a skeletal hand inches from her face. She stumbled back, her foot catching on a root, and she fell, landing hard on the wet ground. Her eyes darted around, desperate for any sign of escape, but the figures only moved closer, their blank faces twisting into grotesque, unnatural grins. Maria, it's time, they chanted, their voices merging into a single echoing sound that filled her head. She scrambled to her feet, her breaths coming in shallow gasps. She couldn't run. The forest was too thick, and the figures seemed to surround her at every turn. But then she noticed something, a faint, silvery glow deep in the woods. It was far away, barely visible through the trees, but looked like an exit, a way out. Without thinking, she sprinted toward the light, dodging branches and roots, ignoring the whispers that grew louder and more frantic. Come back, Maria. The voices chased her, filling the air with despairing cries that clawed at her mind. She could feel their icy breath on her neck, their fingers brushing her hair, their shadows stretching to block her path. But she kept running, her eyes fixed on that distant glow. Just as she reached it, she tripped, landing hard on the forest floor. The glow flickered, wavering in her vision, and she felt her heart sink. But when she looked up, she saw a clearing, bathed in soft moonlight. She stumbled forward, her pulse racing with relief. Then she froze. The clearing was filled with mirrors. Tall, thin mirrors stood in rows, casting faint reflections in the moonlight. Each one was cracked, the glass smeared with something dark. She looked around, confused, until she saw her reflection. In the mirror, she was not alone. Figures stood behind her, their faces twisted and grotesque, their eyes hollow and filled with darkness. She turned, but the clearing was empty. When she looked back at the mirror, the figures were closer, grinning with sharp, crooked teeth. Maria, they whispered, their voices muffled, distorted, coming from deep within the glass. You're one of us now. She backed away, heart pounding, but her reflection stayed frozen in place, staring back at her with wide, terrified eyes. And then, slowly, it smiled, a wide, twisted grin that didn't match the fear on her face. She screamed, reaching out to touch the mirror, but her fingers passed through it, the glass rippling like water. Before she could pull her hand back, the figures inside grabbed her wrist, pulling her forward. No, she cried, struggling, but their grip was iron, their hands cold and lifeless. She felt herself being dragged into the glass, the coldness seeping into her bones. As she was pulled deeper, the reflection of her own face changed, twisting into the same empty, hollow expression as the others. Her mouth stretched into a wide, ghastly smile, and she felt her own face contorting to match it. The last thing she saw was her own eyes staring back at her from inside the mirror, filled with terror, before they too faded, leaving only darkness. The next morning, her car was found abandoned on the side of the road. The police searched the surrounding woods, but there was no sign of Maria. They chalked it up to another disappearance on that cursed stretch of highway. And if you walk deep enough into those woods, some say, you'll find a clearing filled with mirrors, cracked and forgotten, each one holding a glimpse of faces trapped in silent screams, forever lost to the shadows.